Hello and welcome to the Progressive Hub Show. My name is Ryan Black, managing editor at progressivehub.net and organizing coordinator at rootsaction.org. With me to start the show today is Norman Solomon, founder and executive director of the Institute for Public Accuracy at accuracy.org and co-founder and national director of rootsaction.org. How you doing today, Norman?
Oh, hey, doing fine. Hi, Ryan.
All right, let's get right into it. So we're going to talk about this every week because it's so critical. Biden continuing to run for re-election. It's still a bad idea this week, just like it was last week and the week before. A couple updates there from the Hill. Hillary Clinton, Biden has a good record, but people have every right to consider his age. And she's saying this 1 month after that he's already announced. Any surprise there that Hillary's chiming in on age comments?
Well, meet the new Democratic Party leaders, same as the old. We're looking at a spectacle, and of course, the news media love it. I see online just on various browsers, you turn on the computer, it's flooding with all of this gossip and who said what about what. It's a real spectacle. Corporate media loves it. There's very little content, and we're encouraged to see it as sort of a show. But meanwhile, there's a humongous amount at stake with all kinds of dimensions: personal life, social, how we're affected by the economy, the environment, the future, the lack of future that people deserve because of the climate emergency, militarism, the structural racism, economic inequality. But you wouldn't know it from the gossip mongering that passes for political news. And I think that's an example. It's significant. We need to pay attention to it. Hillary Clinton, in this case, saying this, that, and the other. But there's a tendency, even among progressives, to be swallowed up by the corporate media messaging to the point that we forget to focus with others on what this all is about, which is the future, the next generations, and what is going on right now in terms of war in Ukraine, huge Pentagon budget, encroaching and enlarging power of the right wing, suppression of the vote, all the different ways that what we had of democracy is under assault.
Right. And I think that need to consider the next generation, like Hillary Clinton is doing here and like the news media always does, comes down to a conversation about age, when that's not necessarily the most reflective part of what the new generation needs, right?
There's an old problem. It's old thinking. It's old mentalities. It's often the old boys network that some corporate women are led into at the upper reaches of the two political parties. The aged ideas are the big problem. Nobody who is really attuned to what the future needs to be from a progressive standpoint thinks that Bernie Sanders' ideas are too old. The issue is, in this case, the party, the country, the executive branch, led by somebody who has shown that even though in his first months of the presidency, Joe Biden really does not seem to have a serious clue about the need for new approaches to our society, to the world, to governance, to what needs to happen in our own country. When you get outside of the bubble of Wall Street and the tech corridor near where I live, Silicon Valley, along Pennsylvania Avenue, and you just drive through one city or town after another, and you see the shopping centers falling apart, vacant stores, you see that the public arena is being eroded, you see that the libraries are shorter hours, you see the tuitions going up, really, although Biden belatedly did something halfway or partway really about it, student debt is just a huge burden on tens of millions of people, $1.7 trillion worth of debt for what should be a human right, education among people in the United States. I could go on, and I won't really, except to say that there is so much at stake. And as much as we might want to understandably say, screw elections, I don't want to pay attention to these buildups for a campaign and then 2024 balloting coming up, we've got to pay attention. And especially more important than that, we need to devise more strategies and certainly be proactive. People at the grassroots to say, we're just not going to accept what's served up. We want to affect history. We don't want to just consume it.
Right. And, in that same interview, Hillary, obviously age isn't the most important thing to progressives, but while she's bashing Biden for, telling voters they should be concerned about his age, she also makes a strong defense to keep Feinstein in office and to not have her resign. Um, and even though Feinstein is obviously having a lot of health issues and is preventing the Biden administration from getting things done, you have people like Clinton and Pelosi who are backing her. Uh, and I guess the question is, does that ever work out? I mean, I consider what Biden's doing right now, staying in office past when he probably should, when the voters are telling him to move on. I think of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was stayed on probably longer than she should have, and it ended up with another Republican taking her seat over. Uh, do you find any irony at all, or is this just par for the course that the establishment people like Hillary Clinton, like Pelosi, they're always just gonna back their people every time, no matter how much it puts the Democratic Party in a bad position moving forward?
Well, it's become more acceptable to use certain four-letter words in public and political arenas, even among politicians. There's a five-letter word that we ought to be talking about a lot more in terms of the interface between corporations and political figures and so-called leaders. The greed is a five-letter word, the last time I counted. But there's a three-letter word we ought to keep more in mind, and that is EGO. The tremendous role of ego involved. I mean, for all of her virtues, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you don't know who's going to be the next president for the next 4 years, but you stay on after, unfortunately, suffering from cancer and so forth. And as you point out, now we have a stronger right-wing majority on the Supreme Court as a result. And Feinstein also, clear example. Now, she's mentally impaired. There's no question about that, and we don't want to blame her for the disease. But the fact is that for decades now, she's been arrogant. I am a constituent here in California, and the way that she just condescendingly would tell off climate activists is just an indicator in recent years of how out of touch, not because of her age per se, but because of her mentality. And very wealthy, hugely rich family for many, many decades. And these are risk factors when you're really rich, big ones, to be out of touch with what it's like to live, as Bernie says, paycheck to paycheck, and the risks and dangers involved with being on such thin economic ice in a country that does not guarantee health care for everyone, who still treats it as a privilege rather than a human right. So I think, when we circle back to what are human rights and the interface with politics, we have people hanging on, and it's not only that they should be gone long ago, the Steny Hoyers, the Nancy Pelosi's, and in the extreme example, Diane Feinstein, but it's the mentalities that are so lethal. We have a killing field going on constantly, so to speak, in this country. There are studies released recently, again, underscoring into the millions of African Americans who have died because of economic inequality and structural racism around healthcare and nutrition and other factors. We have the human right of housing being put on a higher and higher price tag. So when we look at those sort of contexts, and then we compare it to the gossip-driven, personality-driven electoral news that we keep getting, that we have to pay attention to, I think it underscores that there are profound issues of war and peace and human survival, the nature of society, and those factors go up against structural issues, which I think are fundamental. Who owns what? Corporate power, oligarchy, and so forth, which is a reality in this country. And it also goes to questions of what do individual power mongers do? What are their priorities? And we've seen time and again people in office, corporate creatures, and at the higher levels, to some large degree, all federal officials are corporate creatures. They're beholden to, in some way, through contributions and psychology, corporate power. What are their priorities? And we look at their behavior, and to a large extent, whether you chalk it up to that three-letter word, ego, or whatever, their priorities are about we've got to look out for our own, our friends, our colleagues, our coworkers, our family, and ourselves. And nothing wrong
Yep.
with looking out for one's family, but when it comes as it routinely does, at the cost of zillions of other families, we have a sort of a sociopathic problem.
Absolutely. And I think, another three-letter word, age, isn't as important as ego. One of the factors associated with age, though, is the length of term they've been in office. And that's what makes them really these corporate creatures. That's what makes them want to support all their colleagues. Their only thinking, their only way to think is not like Bernie Sanders says, as a paycheck to paycheck worker, but as a corporate creature in politics who everybody they know is pretty much rich or elected or has some immense amount of power that they're trying to protect. And so they all work together to protect each other. I think what this conversation was really getting to, my big convoluted way that I've gotten here, is what is the long term implication of Biden running in 2024? What does it mean for 2028? That our standard bearer, even if he wins, will be a 91-year-old Joe Biden.
I think even at this relatively late date, we should not accept the idea that it's a slam dunk done deal that Biden will be the Democratic presidential nominee next year. There's a lot of time still to go. He's locked in, he's declared, he's filed with the FEC. Of course, here at rootsaction.org, we launched last summer Don't Run Joe campaign. And frankly, it's been disappointing that other progressive groups have hung back at a national level and left it to, I mean, we're proud of it, but left it to Roots Action to persevere with Don't Run Joe. We're about to announce a new incarnation now that Biden has formally become a candidate. The implications are that it goes again to priorities, that people who are around Biden in the White House, the circle between the Democratic National Committee and the Biden White House, that is a very tight circle. And there are a lot of people who are feeding from the trough financially and in terms of political power, fixers and their futures, personally and professionally, and in their networks, their consulting firms, the revolving doors between their current federal office that they hold or advisory position and the consulting firms that are making out like bandits. I mean, really, when you step back and you see, for instance, Antony Blinken, the current Secretary of State, during the 4 years of the Trump administration, he wasn't off playing golf, and he certainly wasn't doing nonprofit work to benefit communities. He was at West End Exec, a firm that he then had to put, as I recall, about $1 million into some sort of blind trust or get rid of when he became Secretary of State a couple of years ago. They were profiteers. I mean, here's we got a Secretary of State who previously for 4 years was making a huge amount of money brokering weapons sales to the Pentagon. And again, this is what we get back to. And there are so many people in the upper reaches of the White House right now who were at the DNC, who were elsewhere, who were in Congress. And they simply are finding this another era in which to make a lot of money and line up future contacts. So this all circles back to, I think, in a direct way, what's at stake with the Biden presidency trying to become an 8-year instead of a 4-year. Because really, when you look at the priorities of these folks, it's personal, it's professional, it's not only making a lot of money now, but lining up their ducks to make a hell of a lot more money later. But it is also control of the Democratic Party. I think it's fair to say that the first priority is to retain control of the National Democratic Party. And if they can win the next election against Republicans, great. They want to do that. They do want to stay in office. But I believe that there's tremendous evidence that if it were a choice between defeating Republicans, but losing control of the Democratic Party, i.e., with a candidate with the politics of, say, Bernie Sanders, or on the other hand, being in a situation where it's the reverse, they want to retain control of the party. They'd rather lose to Republicans and keep the party than defeat Republicans and lose control of the party. And that's sort of symptomatic of the mentalities and the individual trajectories that we're dealing with from the top of the executive branch and the Democrats in Congress.
I completely agree, and I've long said consultants don't care about winning. They make more money, and fundraising is easier when you're losing. Fundraising is a lot easier when you're attacking Donald Trump and you have no power to change anything. You can say whatever you want than it is if you're actually in power and have to do anything, especially with the corporate Democrats who don't really want to do anything because their donors are the same corporate powers that they pretend to try to fight when Republicans are in power.
Well, they aim to get wealthier and wealthier. That's their neoliberal ideology, and it's a sort of a personal ideology in most cases. And so then you look at that and you say, well, what the fuck? What are they here for? What are they doing? What is the purpose of their so-called public service? Ryan, you and I have both been involved in electoral campaigns, trying to get people into Congress and so forth. And what you're alluding to becomes really clear. There are progressive, very sincere, down-to-earth consultants for election campaigns, but there are a huge number of individual and incorporated entities that are just wailing at making as much money as they can. And classically, and this is across the board, it's not just Republicans, but a lot of Democrats as well. You have family members on payrolls, family members running consulting firms. And what do you know? The contracts of the congressperson or whoever are being given to the family members or close friends from the country club or the modern equivalent thereof. So again, what is the political economy and the underlying motivations here? It's really a pretty grim picture. And so progressives have an opportunity, and I think a compelling imperative obligation to say, we recognize this game. We're not walking away from electoral battles because they're crucial, and we want to build something very different.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think, the family member thing, it gets real weird when you have Nancy Pelosi's daughter as the caretaker for Feinstein. I can't imagine something more corrupt than that when she's personally like defending Feinstein, keeping her in office. And there are major politics in play for how that seat would be replaced if Feinstein were to resign.
Well, that story really broke last week, and I think it's very significant and sort of buttons up what we started to talk about in terms of Feinstein, because here you have a situation where, and of course, these are 6-year Senate terms, there's no doubt that Feinstein will not be a senator come January 2025. So here in California, there's a Senate seat, a real juicy political plum up for grabs. Feinstein has already said she's not going to run, and it's not clear she'll finish this term. So you have a outright militarist, Adam Schiff, running for the Democratic nomination for Senate. And then you have Nancy Pelosi, the former House Speaker, who immediately, when Schiff announced, endorsed him. And that's against two women, Katie Porter and Barbara Lee. And an irony is that for decades, Barbara Lee has deferred to, in many ways, Nancy Pelosi. They were supposed to be real buds. And yet when push comes to shove, just out of the gate, Pelosi endorsed Schiff. The Democratic Party establishment is behind Schiff to take that Senate seat. He's always been a hawk against Russia. He's always been a military hawk. He has voted, except for when he repositioned himself last year, he's always voted to increase Pentagon budgets, up through the ceiling. So this is a gambit now because Governor Newsom, wisely or not, has publicly pledged that if there is a vacancy in Feinstein's seat before her term is over, he will appoint a Black woman. Well, that, as far as I know, leaves Adam Schiff out of the running. And so the fear from Pelosi and from others in the Democratic Party establishment is that if Feinstein doesn't stagger to the end of the finish line for her full 6-year term, then Newsom is, as governor, going to appoint for the rest of the term a Black woman, which then puts Adam Schiff at a distinct disadvantage because he'd be running against an incumbent. There's conjecture that if there is such an appointment, it would be Barbara Lee. We don't know for sure, but we do know that any incumbent in a state like this would be at a huge advantage over Adam Schiff if he were to persist running against somebody already entrenched, a new person in the Senate seat. So this is all just to say that this goes to this underlying dynamic. Here you have Democratic Party leaders, Nancy Pelosi most notably, who is willing to try to prop up somebody obviously not competent to be a mayor of a small town, let alone a U.S. senator, Diane Feinstein at this point. But that's fine with Pelosi. She has her relative as a caretaker now, trying to just insist that Feinstein must complete the rest of her term. Well, that term lasts more than a year and a half still. It's crazy. She doesn't even know where she is. Even mainstream media is making that really clear. And I think it's an example. Ryan, you and I have been talking about in analytical terms these dynamics, but here's a clear example where Nancy Pelosi and the establishment she represents would much more be willing to have the incompetent Dianne Feinstein, the incapable Feinstein, in the Senate for another year and a half, just so they can hotwire their militarist buddy, Adam Schiff, into her seat.
I think that's absolutely right. That's a good summation of what's going on. And I think it's interesting that Pelosi, who has, claims to be this avid abortion rights, women's rights feminist, she would prefer a hawk who can fundraise and get on TV over more progressive candidates, over women, over a Black woman, over having somebody in office right now who could fill the Judiciary Committee so that we can get the votes done so we can protect things like abortion rights.
Oh, right. Well, when you talk about abortion rights, we should recall that Henry Cuellar, the only avidly anti-abortion rights Democrat in the House of Representatives, faced a very close race against Jessica Cisneros back in 2022. It was razor thin. And who made the difference? Nancy Pelosi went out avidly supporting, vocally supporting the Cuellar campaign. And it was such a close race that there was no doubt that this anti-choice Democrat would no longer be in the House except for the support of the supposed feminist, pro-women's rights, pro-abortion rights leader, Nancy Pelosi. And it's disgusting. It's the sort of, we're going to protect our own. It's the incumbent protection racket. And these are incumbents who are corporate Democrats. And I hasten to add, we've got to remember at all times, there is a huge threat of neo-fascism in this country. The two top candidates for the Republican presidential nomination, Trump and DeSantis, they are moving more and more into an outright fascist line. They are certainly neo-fascist. They are extremely dangerous. And so the weaker the Democratic Party is, the more dangerous the Republican Party is.
Yeah, I completely agree. And Democrats aren't showing much signs that they're going to be getting any stronger soon, or that they're willing to do anything to change anything about how the party works to strengthen itself. There's no bench. There's no bench for the Democratic Party.
It goes to priorities, and there's no bench, especially because of the deference to Joe Biden. I mean, the fact is that during the Vietnam War, there was one courageous senator, Eugene McCarthy, who was willing to jump into the New Hampshire primary and then others against President Lyndon Johnson. And that was seen as a quixotic, foolhardy thing to do, but he almost defeated Johnson and pushed him into basically abdicating, saying he wouldn't run for re-election. And then, of course, Robert Kennedy jumped in because it was clear that there would be an opening at that point. So what happened then was something called political courage. And yet, in all these months with abysmal polls, and we should mention that the latest polling shows Trump defeating Biden next year beyond the margin of error. There's one poll, 7 points, Trump ahead. It just blows to smithereens this myth that the White House and the obsequious press corps has been trying to promote for many, many months that, Trump was defeated by Biden last time, so Biden is the one to defeat him again. Well, that's ridiculous. Biden is now would represent, symbolize the status quo. Trump represented it 4 years ago, 6 years ago, whenever that was. But now it's Biden who would be on the defensive, defending the indefensible when we have, according to NBC News, for more than 3 decades now, the highest polling numbers for wrong track in this country. The public saying they think this country's in the wrong track. Is that the time to have a president run for re-election representing the status quo? Of course not. It's ridiculous. And yet we have these terrible polling numbers for Biden, and we've been urging for at Roots Action through the Don't Run Joe campaign, urging that somebody with governmental experience of some great extent or a major leader of a national social movement step forward and say, I'm willing to challenge Joe Biden in the primaries. That has not happened. We have cowardice from the top of the Democratic Party in Congress, from the governors who are Democrats. Where are they? They are AWOL in political terms. And yet people can say, there was a Vietnam War during the late 1960s. True, there's not a Vietnam War per se, although there's plenty of militarism, but there's a class war going on and people are feeling it around this country. So where are the candidates from Congress or elsewhere with the Democratic Party stature willing to step forward? We're still waiting. There's still time, but it's getting ridiculously late. Who has stepped forward? Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is anti-science. His crank theories, which are refuted by overwhelming majorities of scientists and researchers about COVID and vaccines, he's a crank. And Robert Kennedy Jr., he's saying some really good things about militarism and so forth. But if you say that you're concerned with, say, climate, and yet you as a candidate, as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has been doing for years, say stuff that is really antithetical to basic scientific evidence about vaccines, then the hell with him. I mean, I just think that is a ridiculous non-threat to Biden. And we also have Williamson, who means really well, says really good things, but she really has no basis for threatening the power of the Biden White House. They just have no reason to be concerned about her electorally. She's not an electoral threat. And that goes back to that we need someone to run who is willing and able to, as part of social movements, be an electoral threat to the corporate Democratic Party's so-called leadership.
Right. And I think about it from an organizing perspective. The real difficulty with Marianne or RFK is you have big glaring issues that you have to organize around. And all for RFK, specifically, all your organizing will have to be around convincing people that he's not crazy about vaccines. And you're not going to be spending the time doing all the other stuff you need to do. It's such an uphill climb to get him to be able to win if you wanted to anyways. So you're not going to have the organizing base there. Marianne's the same way. She ran for Congress in her district and did not win. She ran for president and did not win a state. She doesn't have the base that would be nice that if she had. She does have a lot of good ideas. She is way more progressive. But again, like you're saying, it's unrealistic that she would win, even if she's polling at 9 or 10% sometimes in the polls. You're just not going to have, barring some viral internet sensation happening that puts her over the top. you're not going to have the organizing base needed to do the literal hours of work and phone calls and door knocking needed to make it happen. And that's
Yeah,
unfortunate.
there's no way in hell that Marianne Williamson is going to
No.
get many delegates to
Yeah.
be going to the National Democratic Party convention.
I'd
And
love to see either of them win in New Hampshire.
well, just to raise the question of vulnerability, because frankly, the opportunism quotient in Congress is generally high.
Right.
And if Biden were shown to be vulnerable, it might shake something loose. But on the other hand, the national polling already shows him to be tremendously vulnerable. And so this really goes to the saying, it's an old saying now, when the people lead, the leaders will follow.
Yeah.
That's really our challenge. We need to be activist about all this. And this applies across the board. We have some people in Congress, very few of them, who have been courageous, who speak out. They're not in Congress just because they got lucky. They're in Congress because social movements propelled them and they were part of social movements. I think of
Right.
Rashida Tlaib, one of the greatest members of the House of Representatives in our lifetimes, because she's willing and able to speak out and be activist about issues that are unpopular, but issues that need to be addressed in a progressive way. I think, for instance, of Palestinian rights. She's
Yeah.
just very clear about it. She believes that human rights belong to everybody, whether you're an Israeli, whether you're a Palestinian. And that should not be controversial. But it's not
Right.
only controversial on Capitol Hill, it's like a third rail. And we need only remember that the vast majority of members of Congress just vote for one ridiculous resolution, absurd resolution pledging fidelity to Israel after another. A country that has hot wired $38 billion or so promised to it over a 10-year period by federal law. So, what does that tell you? No matter what, no matter how much they abuse the rights and kill the people of Palestine.
Yeah. And I think her ability, her willingness to lose, like she stands on her principles. And if she's going to lose because of it, so be it. The fact that she tries to do a anniversary thing for the Nakba in Congress and McCarthy tries to shut it down. It takes Bernie rescuing it to have the event. I mean, she's under fire at all times and is still willing to stand strong. And I think there's not very many others that are like that.
That is true.
So moving on, we've talked about Biden for a long time. You did mention Blinken, Anthony Blinken, before he was the Secretary of State. He was brokering weapons deals, and now as Secretary of State, who would have guessed, Norman? He's brokering weapons deals to
Yeah.
Ukraine.
Good point. Now he's just in a different job.
Right, exactly. He's doing the same thing pretty much. Thoughts on the war in Ukraine? To me, it feels like public sentiments are turning slowly. Have you noticed that at all?
I think there is a gradual shift, and there's more and more of a disconnect between the national media, the corporate media, as well as on Capitol Hill on the one hand, and grassroots sentiment. You have polling showing substantial numbers, sometimes majority of Americans say, let's not just keep shipping all these $1 billion worth of weapons to Ukraine and fueling the fire. Of course, it's horrible what Russia has been doing now for well over a year. The invasion should be denounced. These are ongoing war crimes by the Russian government in Ukraine. That doesn't change the reality that simply throwing billions of dollars worth of weapons into the fray from the United States, that just makes things worse and worse as time goes on. There's no solution there. And you mull over this question of what are the goals or motivations. And it seems pretty clear that the top of the US government is populated by people who really want this war to continue. I mean, that's the reality. There's all this enthusiasm. Let's keep the war going. And that's the antithesis of diplomacy, for which the United States has engaged in basically zero. since it became clear that a Russian invasion was a danger. And there's this notorious event just a few weeks into the February invasion last year of Ukraine, where it seemed that a peace deal was in reach. And then the head of the British government, Boris Johnson, intervened, and the US also made clear it didn't want a peace deal. So, what kind of a country is that? What kind of a leadership is that? And, there's a lot of breastbeating and proud articles and punditry and the hot lights of the studios of US cable networks and so forth. And the messages to Ukrainians: we love you, we support you, let's you and them fight. It's a very convenient attitude that, oh, we're really in solidarity, we're really courageous here, the US government, the American people, we've got the Ukrainian flags all over our country. We really are the moral stalwarts in this situation. We'll keep sending weapons to Ukraine so Ukrainians and Russians keep killing each other. And we're just really great because we're standing firm for our principles. Well, one would think that our principles should include diplomacy, should include the idea that there are such things as diplomatic negotiations that actually aim to end the killing. But that seems to be rather controversial, to put it mildly, on Capitol Hill, as well as in the corporate media of this country.
Right. I think there's something analogous going on in Yemen right now, where you have Yemen who ready for negotiations, Saudi Arabia ready for negotiations, the Houthis, the rebels, ready for negotiations, and it's the US who is not ready to engage in negotiations, does not want a ceasefire yet, because the US's leverage has been minimized right now. We don't have the maximum leverage, so we're not willing to negotiate until we have all the power, is what it seems. And that kind of seems like what's going on in Ukraine as well, because we're not totally dominating and we don't have 100% of the leverage. We don't want to engage in any diplomacy, not to mention the billions of dollars that are being made, that finally the mainstream media is at least kind of coming around to, that the military industrial complex, weapons manufacturers, have been ripping off the American people for all time. This is what they've always done. There's always the stories of the $100 hammer and the, $50 screws. Like, everything costs so much money because there's a lot of no bid contracts, and there's a lot of, there's just rampant. There's also the people paying for the representatives and senators to maintain their power in their seats. So there's not a lot of oversight into any of that.
When you trace it back to the Obama administration, when in the middle of the previous decade, the Saudi-led war on Yemen began, there was a sort of a quid pro quo, according to really reliable reporting, that Obama, and this was a good thing he did, went ahead, wanted the Iran nuclear deal to be finalized, but the Saudi government, which is in great hostile relations towards Iran, didn't want it to happen. So the sort of the trade-off, quid pro quo, was Obama administration said, well, we really want to get this Iran nuclear deal, but we'll wink and nod and actually help you, Saudi Arabia, as you begin to slaughter people in Yemen. And that has continued. And the numbers are more than 200,000 dead in Yemen as a result of the Saudi-led, US-supported war over a period of 7 or 8 years.
Yeah, and the US refusing to engage in serious diplomacy right there has led to China stepping in and brokering a peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, right?
When we're in a situation where diplomacy, some of the moving parts will shift over time, and that's certainly been happening with some alliances related to the Middle East. When we mention the reality of the arms deals, billions of dollars of weapons, while this slaughter has been happening, in the worst cholera epidemic in history in Yemen caused by the war, there have been enormous profits made with the US government being part of the process to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia. And
Right.
despite his pledge of his 2020 campaign, Biden has not really turned off that bloody faucet from continuing to flow. So I think it's really a reality that we cannot trust these folks in power. It's always wrong to think, oh, they're Democrats. Oh, they make good speeches. I like the State of the Union address, so we can ease up, we can trust them. That is a crazy approach that unconsciously, at least, sometimes we are falling victim to. The great journalist I.F. Stone said, all governments lie and nothing they say should be believed. He wasn't saying that governments lie all the time, but he was saying that we should never assume a default position that they're telling us the truth, because so routinely they are not. And the consequences for human beings are often horrendous.
I think that is super wise advice. Uh, the Peace in Ukraine coalition that Roots Action is on the steering committee for had an ad placed in The Hill yesterday. I'm going to share. Here's the front cover of The Hill. We see all those wonderful GOP candidates. And at the bottom on the front page, we have the End the War in Ukraine, read the petition inside. And then on the inside cover, which is great, we have over 105, 106 organizations, some international, and a bunch of prominent signers, including Dan Ellsberg, Noam Chomsky, Matt Ho, Jesse Jackson, Jack Matlock, Ray McGovern. There's all sorts of people in here who signed on to this petition, calling on Presidents Biden, Putin, and Zelensky to stop the killing and devastation, ceasefire, and peace negotiations now. And I'll quickly read it. The war in Ukraine has taken tens of thousands of Ukrainian and Russian lives, uprooted millions, contaminated land and air and water, and worsened the climate crisis. The longer the war goes on, the greater the danger of spiraling escalation, which can lead to a wider war, environmental devastation, and nuclear annihilation. The war diverts billions that could be addressing urgent human needs. Total military victory cannot be achieved by either Russia or Ukraine. It is time to support the calls by Pope Francis, UN Secretary General Guterres, Presidents Lula da Silva of Brazil, Erdogan of Turkey, Xi of China, and others for a ceasefire and a negotiated end to this calamitous war. Stop the killing, agree to a ceasefire, and begin negotiations. Norman, why is that such a controversial petition for people?
It's controversial because we have a military machine and a mentality and corporate media that has dubbed the idea, even the very word of diplomacy, as somehow anathema to the situation in Ukraine. And as soon as a word and a concept like diplomacy becomes tarred and feathered and run out of town, so to speak, out of the beltway town, then there's a big fear factor. It is the third rail not to touch if you have a or want to have a political future in Congress, with very few exceptions. And this is where constituents come in. At rootsaction.org, we really are about people organizing, not only toward government, but including to address as constituents members of Congress, because they all come from somewhere. And no matter where we live in the United States, we are purportedly represented by 2 senators and a House of Representatives rep. So at rootsaction.org, we really invite people be part of this process. We have more than 1 million people who have taken actions and stayed with us, and we want more people to be involved, because that's everything we have to be proud of in this country. Not anything that was handed down from on high. It was always created, generated, organized from the bottom up.
Yeah. Hold on. I agree. I'm trying to share this tab right now from Progressive Hub. Here it is. And just a reminder that on progressivehub.net, you can visit any story on there and there's an action attached to it. So, for instance, this recent article from Jeffrey Sachs in Common Dreams, Jeffrey Sachs, who signed the petition, says the military industrial complex is triggering U.S. debt crisis. And then right there, as you're reading the article, you can write a message to your representative and senators and ask them to commit to cutting the military budget by at least 10%. So we strongly urge you to go to progressivehub.net every day it's updated with some of the most important stories that progressives and the left cares most about, and they're always paired with an action that you can take right then and there so that you can put your anger to work and you can put your frustrations with this never-ending war and this debt crisis and immigration and the environment, the climate crisis, everything. You can take action right then and there and actually do something. So we strongly recommend everyone check that out.
It's understandable that people are angry about so much. What we need, though, is less venting and more doing. And I would urge everybody listening to our conversation here to make a habit of going to progressivehub.net and not only informing yourself, but on the same page, literally and figuratively, you can do something about it. It might take 1 minute, but we need each other to take action, and progressivehub.net is a place to do it.